Hello, everyone. Really excited to be here. I think it's been an incredible few days. If you can't tell by my voice, it's been invigorating, energizing. I think it's easy to forget that most of the devs here and all of the activity on Solana has happened in the last 6 to 12 months. So there's a really unique energy that's really new and really fresh and really exciting. So just really grateful to be here with you all. I'm here with Greg Exithalis, who is the GC of Multicoin, and Michelle Bond, who is the CEO of Atom, which is one of the most prominent crypto advocacy firms in DC. And we're hoping to chat about a topic we're trying to find clarity in crypto. And I think for those paying attention, a lot of regulators recently have been suggesting that there is clarity and that market participants are getting it wrong. But I think, as we'll see today, there's actually a lack of clarity, and they're really interesting questions that lawyers and builders like yourselves are really pushing the boundaries on. So before we dive in, maybe Michelle, you could just tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about the work that Atom is doing.
Yeah, certainly. So first, I am so thrilled to be here in Lisbon. How amazing. And this is the most beautiful venue I've ever spoken at, so thank you. My name is Michelle. As Jed mentioned, I am the CEO of the Association for Digital Asset Markets, and we are a Washington, D.C.-based trade association. We are not a registered lobbying association. What we do is standard setting for the industry. So we have a code of conduct, and we do heavily work on policy. So we work very closely with the U.S. government and on a variety of different initiatives. A little bit about my background. I've spent my whole career in policy. I'm also a lawyer, like my esteemed panelists here. I practiced law, but I was on the Senate Banking Committee, and I wrote portions of the Dodd-Frank Act and the Jobs Act, and then I went to the SEC, and I was a lawyer for the SEC. Thank you. It's really annoying. Thank you. I was a lawyer for the SEC, and I wrote regulations. We wrote the cross-border derivatives rules, and then I ran regulatory affairs for Bloomberg. And honestly, a lot of people it's very funny because a lot of people are like, well, what is Bloomberg? Bloomberg was fintech from the 1980s. There is actually some history for fintech. Obviously, Bloomberg, it was a very interesting time because the company was largely becoming regulated. And I think that is actually, it paves the way for kind of like what we're doing now in the more modern fintech space, because obviously we're starting to see a ton of regulation, and there's a lot of history there. And anyway, so it's a very exciting space. And go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I'm Greg Exithalis. I'm the General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at Multicoin Capital, which is a thesis-driven investment firm that invests across the digital asset spectrum, Web3, open finance, and we have a little bit of an interest in the Solana ecosystem, I believe. Yeah, my background, I started working as a lawyer about 16 years ago, but at the end of 2012, I got into crypto through being hired to do the first Bitcoin ETF, or at least try to. And at the time, it was really a blank slate for crypto. And the evolution of regulation in the space has moved forward a very, very long way. There was literally nothing on paper in 2012. We've advanced quite a long way, particularly in addressing Bitcoin, but also some other elements of the ecosystem. My work with crypto companies slowly evolved from being a small portion of my practice to being a large portion, and representing centralized institutions, both legacy financial institutions and emergent crypto institutions like custodians, exchanges, asset managers. And this past July, I joined Multicoin, and really excited to work with my comrades in the space, as well as our team and our portfolio companies on trying to find clarity. And I just do want to note before I throw it back to you, Jed, thank you to you, to Anatoly, to Raj. This is an amazing conference, and it's amazing what Solana has built over the course of the last 3 years, but particularly over the course of the last year and this, and even a live stream. My 2-year-old daughter is watching me right now at home in New York, so hi, Emma.
Hi, Emma.
Hi, Emma.
It's great to meet you.
Amazing. So, Greg, as you know, I want to set the stage a bit. We're here. We're in Europe. We're in Lisbon. We have colleagues from the U.S. We have colleagues from abroad. Crypto lawyers often think in a very U.S.-centric way. You know, how should projects, developers be thinking about orienting themselves and worrying about U.S. regulations as opposed to various international ones?
So one of the best lawyers in the space, who's a friend to all three of us, a guy named Lewis Cohen at DLX Law, has a saying that cracks me up every time I hear it, which is, they got laws there too. And it's an important reminder, but it also is reflective of the fact that there is importance to the focus on U.S. Law for a couple of reasons. One, they actually have been further out in acting, not always in providing clarity, but in acting. And one of the reasons for that also is they have a broader concept of what's known as extraterritorial jurisdiction, which means that wherever you are in the world, if you are engaging in business within the US, they will have the potential and often do try to bring you within the regulatory ambit of US law and how it's applied, and in particularly with enforcement. We have seen that with a number of crypto companies that were entirely offshore but serviced US customers. Traditionally in the centralized CeFi space, but we're also seeing increasing focus on the DeFi space. So there's importance there. There's also an element of the US tends to set a higher bar, but that by no means is to imply that we don't have to keep a global focus, because that's what this technology is. At its base layer, at the protocol layer, we're talking about something that can be accessed in a permissionless way in some cases. Not all blockchains are permissionless, but in what we're talking about today is permissionless systems where there are no borders, and where there are also actually very interesting conversations to be had about what is the jurisdiction, where does a transaction take place when it's movement on a blockchain.
And I would actually add to that, the regulators are all part of these international regulatory bodies. So there's the Financial Stability Board, and there's IOSCO, which is I think it has 180 securities commissions in it. So all these regulators are all talking with one another. So even if someone thinks they're in one jurisdiction or that jurisdiction's not applicable, they're all talking, and they're very closely coordinated. The other thing I would also mention is a lot of projects think, okay, well, you know what? I'm not in the U.S., but they might have a server in the U.S. or like some data or something. Be really careful with that, because I have seen the regulators look to, claim jurisdiction and, U.S. territoriality because of that server or whatever the case might be. So it is very, very important that if you're not in the U.S., you're like completely out of the U.S.
I totally agree, and I think it's easy to forget that the SEC and OFAC's jurisdiction is so broad that given the way crypto moves, these projects moves, if they want to go after you, they will almost always have jurisdiction over you or your project, even if you're super airtight about watching out for servers and having boots on the ground in the U.S. It's really a broad mandate. I think there's a narrative in crypto that we're going to lose the war for crypto supremacy in the U.S. and that we're having this big brain drain and this talent move offshore. Do you think regulators are thinking like that, Michelle? Are they looking at this as this great missed opportunity, or are we in a bubble? Are the crypto Twitter folks in a bubble when it comes to thinking about this opportunity?
I think the regulators really do care. I mean, let me put it this way: if the regulators in the U.S. wanted to stamp out crypto, that would have happened. And that would have happened a long time ago. That has not happened. And what we're seeing is it's a difficult adjustment, but what they're working on is a way to adapt. And I think that's a really positive and great sign. However, I think there's obviously there's a big learning curve there. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. But I do think that, look, from a policymaker standpoint, they see jobs, they see innovation. We can be obviously a technology leader, and they also see an expanded tax base. So, I mean, I don't think it was lost on anyone here what just happened with the infrastructure bill. There was a really harmful crypto provision in it. That's going to bring a lot of money into the federal government. So that's actually, from a government standpoint, I think, I think a lot of regulators would probably view that as a very positive thing. So it's just a balancing test. I mean, they also want to make sure that they have appropriate regulation in place.
And I think the longer crypto survives, the more obvious those benefits are going to be. And we just have to keep going and keep lasting. Greg, one complaint I get from everyone, all the developers I get to chat with, is like, where do I focus my attention? Because every day there seems to be a new speech from a regulator, guidance out of FATF, an infrastructure bill, IRS stuff. It's really overwhelming. And what do you think is the single biggest risk from this alphabet soup? What is the biggest thing that could impact developers and the industry?
So since I am on the home continent, I will use a quote my father, who's Greek, told me, which is from Heraclitus, tapantare, which is the stream always flows. And the concept is when you step in a stream, it's never actually the same stream because the water has changed it. Oftentimes, that's what it feels like to be a lawyer in crypto, and I'm sure it's the same for devs. But when you're thinking about what the first steps are, there's a lot. I mean, you've got to focus on code and product, because if you don't have the code, you don't have the product, nothing's going to go anywhere. So that has to be the first focus. But what doesn't get lost on that, or what should not get lost on that, is the importance of understanding the implications of code decisions. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a lawyer, although it's always great to talk to a lawyer. Unfortunately, there aren't that many of us who are really ingrained in the crypto space. But you need to have advice to understand what you're building and how it is implicated in various regulatory regimes. You can start with thinking about the US, but you also need to think particularly about home jurisdictions, and you in particular also need to think about tax implications when you're doing things, because this is a major issue that some projects don't think enough on, and it's very hard to roll back a foot fault on tax. We've seen that with a lot of projects since 2014, 2015, where there were serious tax issues. But it's a very lawyer thing to say, but it depends, because it is going to be subject to what you're building. The questions that a protocol layer has are going to be very different from the great folks at Drift who are up here before us. And you need to have conversations with people who have worked through this before and who can give you a sense and some guidance, because if you identify those issues while you're still building, and maybe you've already released a test net, but before you go mainnet or before you exit beta, you want to have thought about these things to issue spot and then identify fixes.
Michelle, do you think there's one non-dependent risk from all of this alphabet soup that keeps you up at night?
So, yeah, I mean, so one of the things that our group is focused on is, so Adam, we have a code of conduct, and what it does is it creates standards for market integrity in the crypto spot market. So that's something that the industry has developed on its own, which is awesome. Like, that's exactly the role that you want to see industry playing. And it's very loose. Our code is very loosely modeled off of the global FX code. And to be honest with you, so all of our members agree to adhere. Multicoin is a member, FTX, we have a lot of members here. But like, that's a great role for industry to be playing, as opposed to, just always having the federal government lead. And one of the things that I would hope doesn't happen is for industry to sort of like get shut out of the regulatory and like the policy making conversations. And I wouldn't want to see, like, for example, just the SEC and the CFTC just bringing enforcement action after enforcement action. I think it would be really helpful for the industry to be working on standards. And to that end, one of the things that I would personally like to see is a self-regulatory organization, such that perhaps we would not have just the SEC and the CFTC. Like, there could be an SRO that's dedicated to digital asset markets, and that would be sort of like an industry-led, sort of solution, the same way we have FINRA on the securities and broker-dealer side. and the NFA on the future side. So that's something that is at least, under discussion, at least in DC right now, for policy. But otherwise, I think the alternative, at least if it's just going to be enforcement only, I think that keeps me up at night. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest critiques we hear about self-regulation is that it's always pretty loose, and that if the industry insiders get together, they're not going to have the best interests of the public. Are you concerned about that perception? And second, there's a lot of worry that by voluntarily disclosing things, if you're a project, if you're a dev, you're actually giving a regulator more material to work with to go after you. So there's perverse incentives in many ways in self-regulation.
So, look, self-regulation has been around for a very long time. There was the Maloney Act Amendment in 1938, which basically allowed for national securities associations, and that's what created the NASD, which is FINRA now. So we have a lot of precedent on creating these things. Digital assets are new, so it would take an act of Congress, some legislative text. Maybe we'll see some soon. But in any event, I think that this is a real possibility, and I think it would get bipartisan support. So a lot of the criticisms, I actually think would not really apply here. If you look at what Adam is doing with our code of conduct and setting the standards, our regulation at Adam is actually higher than anything the regulators have put out themselves. So we have principles in existence that really don't exist anywhere, and that's something that the industry has taken initiative, and they said, look, we have the responsibility to do this ourselves. We have the expertise, we have the responsibility, and that's what our members have really done. And then on the other side of that, it is nice for it to be industry, like I said. So I think there's definitely there can be some really great bipartisanship in this. And then as far as disclosure goes, we have in the U.S., we do not have a merit-based regime like other countries. In the U.S., we have a disclosure-based regime, and as long as you're disclosing, whatever the items are that would be required, and putting the information out to the public without any bearing on whether it's, whether an investor likes it or doesn't like it or anything like that, as long as it's truthful. That's what our law requires in the U.S. at least. Other jurisdictions have other things, and you probably have other things to add to this too, Jed. And I bet you have lots to say on this.
Yeah, Greg, would you encourage devs in your portfolio to make voluntary disclosures about anything from code to token holdings to company makeup? I think this is a hot topic now.
It is a hot topic, and I think we should level set that to the extent we have an act of Congress that establishes an SRO, it will be a framework for disclosure that's included in that, which should at least provide some comfort that if you are giving disclosures, it's within an ordered system where you should not be exposed to additional liability for being transparent. But transparency is also an important point for regulators to understand and for the industry to really promote, is that in many ways what all of you are building in open finance and Web3, it does challenge the way regulators have previously operated in the US in particular, but also globally, which is they identify a central party, an intermediary who is capable of seeing the state of play and the entire field level, and is capable of identifying when things that are bad happen. And that's why we have brokers as core regulators, why we have clearing parties as core regulators, why we have banks and money transmitters as core regulated parties, because that's where the data lies, the visibility lies. That's not the way blockchains work. Now, there may be intermediaries, whether centralized or otherwise, that interact with blockchains, but we have a data set, and for something that's truly native, it's a near perfect data set. Now, that won't always cover everything, like who owns what token deals have been made as far as lockups or things like that, what developments may be coming on a GitHub. But you do have a native, generally speaking, transparent set of data, which in and of itself can be a tremendous tool for regulation, and one that frees us from a system that relies on trying to impose burdens and obligations on parties that are ill-suited within this technology to actually assume those roles.
I also think that the typical disclosures that you would expect don't matter. So if I go to a DEX or a borrow-lend protocol, I don't need the financials of the company that originally created that software. Or I might care much less about the founder's token holdings if the project has been out for 2 or 3 years. So I think there's an issue with the structure of a disclosure-based regime, and I think between GameStop and the meme coins, I think the idea of a disclosure-based regime is being called into question because the crowd doesn't care. You don't need a disclosure to trade Shiba Inu, right? This is just a new form of speculation, and I think shoehorning in an old disclosure-based regime is not quite going to get the investors the protection that regulators would seem to suggest it would.
And that's especially true when we think about truly decentralized projects, where you don't have singular parties who are controlling, and under those circumstances, you may have certain areas where disclosure might be appropriate if there is a core group of individuals who are driving the bus on a project. But when you've achieved the mythical decentralization that is rather ill-defined, that also changes the appropriateness of requiring a party to make disclosures.
Completely. And we're slowly running out of time, but I want to stick on sufficient decentralization because if we go back to the question earlier, I think I'm in the minority, but I still think that the SEC is the single greatest threat to crypto over the next 2 years. I think the battles over stablecoins and the laws that might come out of the FATF guidance, those are the biggest battles that the industry will face. But in crypto, 2-3 years out might as well be an eternity. Mm-hmm. And so I think the question of sufficient decentralization, which is really the guidepost that most crypto projects are reaching to, stemming back to the Bill Hinman speech, which said that Ethereum was no longer considered a security because the network had reached sufficient decentralization. That's still what most projects have to work with. So, Michelle, do you think regulators and government officials see this as a utopia? What do they think when they hear a sufficiently decentralized network?
So it's funny because the context means everything, right? So for securities laws, like decentralization is like really important, and that's like a good thing that anyone would want to achieve, because once something, as you said from the Hinman speech, once something is sufficiently decentralized, then that makes it much less likely to be deemed to be a security, right? And if something's a security, then there's a whole host of regulation that comes along with that, and anything touching it has to be a broker-dealer, and there's suitability and like all kinds of issues, and then of course it's SEC regulated. So there's the decentralization on like the securities law sort of like definitional question, but then there's also decentralization in terms of like the way the government sort of like more broadly looks at this space, and I really think it goes back to what Greg was just saying. It's like these regulators are used to regulating intermediaries, and that's always been sort of the hook. It's like who's the person? Who am I going to get the information from? And I think it's a really scary thing, and it's just now getting like the government's now just starting to talk about it. But the more that the federal government feels like they can't get access to information, they don't know who to go to, and like obviously there are privacy and like all kinds of issues. I think it's a scary thing, and obviously they're worried about retail investors getting hurt, but like there's so much more that they're worried about. So I think like as this like notion of decentralization gets like even bigger, I think that the government's going to view this as maybe not necessarily a good thing, and they're going to want to look for ways to like not necessarily stop it, but they're going to have to figure out something to do with this. So
I think the best projects on Solana and the projects that have the best legal strategy when they go to market structure their business and their protocol so they are not an intermediary.
Yeah.
So I think Serum and Metaplex are the two best examples of this. And I think we're going to see a lot more projects follow this model where when you go to Metaplex, there's actually no product, right? It's a back-end and front-end reference implementation. It's a tool. Yes. And I think people in crypto would do well to stop thinking as things as protocols, but as
Yeah.
widgets or tools. And these tools are truly, legally agnostic, and you can use it to run an NFT drop that's fully compliant, and you can use it to sell a security, but it doesn't really matter. And it really gives the users the ability to do whatever they want with the product, to grow exponentially, like we've seen with all the NFT drops on Metaplex. And again, same with Serum. This is a marketplace, and depending on how you structure it, who you block, who you include, what you sell, you can have all types of markets, and these tools have really proliferated. So I think it's important for builders to really think of themselves as trying to get away from being that intermediary and letting people run with it.
Yeah, you don't operate the tool that you're building. You put it out for others to operate, and part of that goes to this issue of what are some of the other areas that decentralization means, and one of them is, do you actually control the tool, and that's on an active basis? Can you gate who accesses it? Can you force people off the system? In the concept of probably the most fleshed out decentralization in the US concept comes from money services laws, where you're an administrator of a token network or convertible virtual currency network if you have the ability to either forcibly redeem someone, to force someone to transfer assets, or if you have the ability also to control the consensus around it, how it actually functions, or the upgrades or updates to the software or to the smart contract, which is why one of the most important things that new development teams have to be thinking about is, if they're launching something that's smart contract based, what are they doing with administration keys? How are they structuring governance voting? And on multi-sigs in particular, understanding that it can be complicating to have a sufficient and necessary number of keys within the house of the development team, because suddenly that can turn you into an administrator theoretically, even if you have governance votes, if they're still contingent upon the multi-sig holders acting.
Someone really smart on Capitol Hill who works a lot on crypto issues said to me, I thought it was great. He said, if there's a kill switch, it's centralized. And I was like, that's probably a good rule of thumb.
I think it's 100% the case, and a problem I see is that projects don't prioritize it from the get-go. And if you think you're going to run a centralized business for 18 months and then give away some light decision-making about fees or parameters to the community, it's going to be a really uphill battle for you to get to that meaningful decentralization. And the teams that prioritize it out the gate and think about pushing out control, not having the admin key, I think are going to put themselves in a much better position. We only have 2 minutes left, Michelle, but I know you've been working on some pretty exciting things on the Hill. Would love to maybe get a preview from what you can share about kind of what's coming next.
Yeah, so certainly. I think we should expect a flurry of legislation coming out of Capitol Hill. I think all the focus is on our issues, guys. So I'm really busy. I can promise you that we're going to be very, very, very busy in the coming months, and at least 1 year. So I think the legislation is going to focus on a variety of areas. We'll see stuff on self-regulation, consumer protection. We'll see some things on the custody side. But I can assure you the lawmakers are working hard on this right now.
Would there be changes to the infrastructure bill, or is this new surface area?
Okay, lots of new, but the Wyden-Lummis-Toomey amendment is not dead, okay? We are still working on that, and that will we're looking to attach that to something else as well. So stay tuned. That needs to pass. So
amazing. And Greg, what about on the ETF front as the Bitcoin ETF OG?
Yeah.
Are we going to see a spot?
Well, what I first want to just comment is that it is a nice thing to remember that although sometimes regulation in crypto seems very antagonistic, there are a lot of people in regulatory and legislative centers around the globe who are very enthused about this space and who are working hard both to understand it and try to get it right, And oftentimes, some of the regulation that we view as bad is actually not like, it's not ill-intentioned. They're trying to do their job, but they just don't either get it from a technical level or they don't share the same ideologies that we have. On a Bitcoin ETF, that's actually one of the areas where I think they are trying to do their job and they're getting it wrong. There should be a spot Bitcoin ETF. It's a better product. It's a simpler product. It's a safer and more investor-protected product. There's one of the spot Bitcoin ETPs that's coming up for its final review this week. I'm not optimistic about that, but I am optimistic about 2022 because it's time.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. We'll be around for the next bit. If anyone wants to chat, you guys were a great panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.